So today I want to talk about one of the more infamous time periods in comic book history, known as the Dark Age of comics. The Dark Age is generally agreed to have begun around 1986, a watershed year in comics too that time, seeing the publications of Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, Alan Moore's The Watchmen. Both The Watchmen and The Dark Knight Returns were heralded as huge movements and progressions in the superhero genre, with much more grittier, much more realistic views on the characters. It was an incredible time period. We hadn't seen anything like that before. This era showed a growing trend from these comics moving away from the campiness that we associate with the Silver Age of comics. Characters who were once pillars like of truth and justice were morphed into these morally kind of gray anti-heroes. And as the characters changed, so did the industry itself. Over the next few years, comics became less focused on the character of the comic and much more who the artist behind the comic was. The 90s in this case were dominated by artists like Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, and Todd McFarlane, who just generally ruled the landscape. They eventually would go on to create a comic book publication that would change the comic book industry forever, known as Image Comics. So let's talk about the origin of Image Comics. With the popularity of comics growing in an artist-dominated industry, it was only a matter of time that disputes between the publishers and the artists would come to a head. Creator rights became a battleground for artists, and it was a key reason that Image Comics was founded by comic artists like Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, Todd McFarlane, and many others. The books that were published were not controlled by a central editor under the Image flagship, and they were free to generate content of their own choosing. The comics were also no longer held to the conventional superhero tropes, and they were allowed to focus on some of the trends of that time period, like anti-heroes, high levels of violence and sex. And these created a boom in the comic industry for the sales for new titles like Spawn, Wildcats, and Youngblood, to name a few. For example, Spawn is probably the best example of the craze that created this bubble in the industry. Spawn #1 sold around 1.7 million copies during this time period. Now, while you could argue that this era in comics also produced great works like Neil Gaiman's Sandman, Grant Morrison's Doom Patrol and Animal Man, and also Chris Claremont's run on the Uncanny X-Men, you could also argue that the bad greatly outweighed the good. The violence and the sex that was portrayed did not have the same nuance and artistic use, for example, like titles like Watchmen, but instead devolved into these misogynistic portrayals of women and created anti-heroes who were a little more than psychotic killers, justifying a means to an end. Ultimately, DC and Marvel were also greatly affected by this movement in the 90s with changes in their industry. Sagging sales in DC and the threat of bankruptcy for Marvel pushed their titles to a new direction in hopes of cashing in on the trends of the 90s. For example, DC tried reinventing the wheel with comic events that saw both Superman and Batman being replaced with more modern interpretations of the character. This is famously depicted in the Batman series Nightfall. One of the greatest Batman villains in his history would be introduced during the 90s, a character known as Bane. Bane came about from the Nightfall series, which introduced him into the Batman mythos as the one man to break the back of Batman, nearly sending him out of the comics indefinitely. Batman was at that time viewed to be unable to continue his mission. He was paralyzed from the waist down, and at this point, Batman makes the decision that he can no longer continue on his quest, that he's going to pass the mantle of Batman onto a new person. He chooses a man named Jean-Paul Valley, who at the time in the comics was known as a man named Azrael. Azrael is a perfect example of the changing stances that we saw at DC in terms of how they view their superheroes. Azrael did not share in Batman's stance of the belief of no killing, and was very much a product of the Image comics that we'd seen during that time period, just in his comic design as well. His suit that he created was a very stylized robotic suit. It had many types of armaments built into it that were lethal weapons, ranging from bladed claws, missiles, shurikens, that he would use mercilessly on his opponents. Superman would also be replaced during this time period in DC history with an event called the Death of Superman. DC introduced the character of Doomsday literally out of nowhere. He would be emerging from an underground container or prison of sorts, and would immediately be put into a collision course with the Man of Steel. Along the way, we see Doomsday's motivations are paper thin. He has little disregard for life, he kills animals along the way, and he also meets other members of the Justice League and promptly starts to fight them. The fight, though, would go poorly for the Justice League. Many of them were maimed and injured and beaten badly, and the fight comes to the doorstep of the city of Metropolis. Now, as the fight is raging throughout the city, it's determined by Superman as he's fighting him that he cannot simply just stop Doomsday. He's not going to be able to put him into a prison. Superman determines that the only real course of action that he has is that he's going to have to kill Doomsday. Superman's decision to kill Doomsday shows how DC is yet again willing to change the foundations of the core beliefs that we've had in characters like Batman and Superman to fit with the growing trends of the 90s. Doomsday would be stopped by Superman in the end, but not without great sacrifice. Superman sustained terrible injuries and dies because of these injuries. And it allows DC to introduce a new series that would be known as the Reign of the Supermen. In this story, we see 4 new reimaginings of Superman to replace the character. These range from edgier, more modern takes with characters like John Henry, who is literally a man made of steel, where he has his own steel suit he's made. We have the Vindicator, who is a man made of energy, kind of to reflect Superman's connection to the sun. We have Superboy, which is cloned from Superman's DNA to hopefully bring in younger viewers. And my personal favorite, which is Cyborg Superman, because it reminded me of one of my favorite movies of the time period that had come out. It was RoboCop. Now, Marvel was also trying to reinvent themselves as well. They were trying to avoid bankruptcy, and they decided that in order to drive sales, they were going to create an event called Heroes Reborn. Ironically, with this event, Marvel outsourced a lot of the art and the story writing to artists like Rob Liefeld and Jim Lee from Image Comics. Heroes Reborn would be a reset for the Marvel Universe. At this point, we're introduced to the antagonist known as Onslaught. This character has many of the similarities that DC's Doomsday has. It's a near unbeatable enemy. His origins are quite strange. He's derived from psionic energies of both Xavier and Magneto in the X-Men comics, and he slowly but surely tries to take out the world as a global threat. With the introduction of Onslaught, he is immediately poised as a doomsday device for Earth, and many of the Marvel's flagship characters go to battle him. They are believed to be destroyed during the skirmish, but this is actually not true. The heroes are not dead. Instead, they're trapped in a pocket dimension made by Mr. Fantastic's son named Franklin Richards. Now, in this pocket dimension, this allowed the storytellers to have new interpretations of the old background stories of these characters and to give them a modern twist while existing in a new universe that was free of continuity. Now, ultimately, this would be a huge success for Marvel and would actually pull them out of bankruptcy, but it was the victim of both bad storytelling and bad art. Now, while the art of the 90s is iconic and outlandish, there are too many moments of the quality of the work falling into embarrassing levels. No image better summarizes the lack of quality than Rob Liefeld's drawing of Captain America. This deformed and misshapen depiction of Captain America shows how publications had literally sacrificed editorial control for sales. The trends of this time in comics would eventually collapse under its own weight with an oversaturation of the market. Many fans didn't appreciate their favorite characters being altered to such a way that they were but shadows of their previous selves. Fans of the comics could argue that we're still in the midst of the dark age of comics, with comics being written more and more towards older readers in mind. Now, since the bubble of the comic book industry burst, sales have actually plummeted. For example, as mentioned before, Spawn issue number 1, this comic sold in the millions. But now, for a successful comic book writer, we see that a successful title will only hit somewhere around 100,000 units. The hardcore fans that stayed with the medium and kept the industry alive, they have driven the publisher to focus on stories more towards their older readers, while younger readers have been left behind. Now, the comic book industry has seen a huge upswing in popularity in the early 2000s with the help of the movie industry. New fans have actually grown in tremendous numbers due to the popularity of the superhero genre that took over in the last 15 years. While Marvel has dominated the market with successes like Iron Man, Captain America, and the Avengers in their cinematic universe, DC has given us the Dark Knight trilogy, and they're also hoping to make a big impact with the impending release of Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice this March. The quality of comics have also grown in leaps and bounds for publishers, and the format is experiencing another golden age of storytelling. In direct opposition to the artist-driven market of the 1990s, the comic book industry has since taken a focus with writers now. Writers like Brian Michael Bendis, Jeff Johns, Grant Morrison, and Brian Kane Vaughan, just to name a few, have taken us out of the dark and into the light with their storytelling. Some of their notable titles include Jeff Johns' run on Green Lantern, Brian Michael Bendis' run on The Ultimate Spider-Man, and Grant Morrison's All-Star Superman. But I would say the best example of comics that are in direct opposition to everything we experienced in the 90s would be Grant Morrison's All-Star Superman. It's full of hope, gives us the best interpretation of the Superman mythos, and it shows us how comics can thrive with a character that makes us all want to be more than who we are, and it dares us to dream again. That's going to be it for our take on the dark ages of comics here. I hope you enjoyed. Look for our shows coming up here on the YouTube channel in the near future. But until then, check us out next time on Bros Before Heroes.